Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with eyes to eat like comfort food, to disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims? Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace with ilkes and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal breath to prove a claim you make, and folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes, it's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason stay strapped with logic and facts. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road, the reason.
Hi, welcome to Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century. I'm Rob Penzak.
And I'm Larry Mendoza.
And we're going to be joined today in a few minutes by Mark Reimers, who's a mathematician and neuroscientist. We're going to talk about morality in the brain with an evolutionary slant. But first we're going to start off with some news. Larry, you want to start by talking about Islamic extremism in the context of ISIS?
Yeah, well, I want to kind of draw or talk about a contrast that people have come up to me in a recent time on Facebook and things like that. I like to criticize all religions equally. That's one thing, that I do. And it's funny how when I'm on Facebook and I'm criticizing Christianity, I have a lot of my liberal friends agreeing with me in a lot of things. But the minute I start to criticize Islam, I tend to have a lot of liberal friends of mine start criticizing me for criticizing Islam. And so what I want to, and one of the big criticisms is that they say I paint all Muslims under one big broad brush, and it's not fair to Islam.
Okay. What's funny is some people go so far out of their way, and we'll talk about some of them, to say, I'm not saying all Muslims are like this, and then just talk about Islam.
Right.
But
what my biggest problem is, and the point I want to come across to these people, so this is in light of ISIS and ISIL, or Islamic State, the Caliphate, whatever you want to call it. These are Muslim fundamentalists, they're extremists, they're radicals. And so, but the one thing I want to point out to everybody is, more importantly, they are Muslims, okay? There's no denying that are Muslims. Now, there have been a lot of the so-called moderates out there that are denouncing these people as non-Muslims, okay? And I read this interesting article on a website called leftfootforward.org that says, the title of the website is, "By denouncing ISIS as not Muslims, moderate Muslims risk making things worse." And it's kind of the point that I'm talking about. And I know Sam Harris has touched a lot on the idea of moderate, how moderates actually hurt the cause even more. But basically, what the reason, and I agree with this, it's these moderate Muslims use something called, it's an Islamic tenet called takfirism, or takfir, which is a process of denouncing rival Muslims, okay, as apostates or non-Muslims. And we're seeing this now with these moderate Muslims, and also these anti-Islamicists that are trying to isolate these extremists as something completely different. But what this does, though, is that takfirism is also used by the extremists by calling moderates non-Muslims. And what it does is if you keep using this, it reinforces this ideological underpinning of takfirism, which is used on both sides of the camp. Unfortunately for the extremists, when they use this, it becomes very violent. And this idea of extremism in Islam has been around for a very, very long time, whereas moderate Islam is a relatively new Western thing. So that's the biggest criticism I have. It's like, by trying to call these people non-Muslims, first of all, we get into this whole idea of the true Scotsman fallacy. Who's a true Muslim, who isn't a true Muslim. Both sides are claiming this takfirism, which is the idea of takfir is what we need to defang in and of itself. And so we need to call these people Muslims. They are Muslims first and foremost. They are an Islamic state. That's what they want. Now, whether most moderates agree with them or not, they're still Muslims, and you can't destroy hundreds of years of historical context of these people and how they interpret the book. So, to all the critics out there, I don't paint all these people. I'm not. I understand that they're extremists and they're moderates, but they're all Muslims, and that's a point that we need to get across.
Right. One of the things that you have to get to is, it's been like this historically with religion, where each side is going to claim that they're the, they have the true and accurate understanding of God. The real problem is that we still believe there are these holy books written by God that have some authority. The better response from the liberal community might be, all of this is bogus. You shouldn't be allowed to behead anybody, whether it says that or not. It doesn't matter which of you is reading that book more accurately. That book is not a valid source of morality, which is something that we'll talk about later today.
Exactly. It's not a good source of morality because, again, by the very tenets of that book, you can justify anything. You can justify the extremism. You see that in the Bible as well.
Right, can and have justified slavery, the Inquisition, the witch hunts, whatever you want to justify.
And who is one group to tell another that they're not true Christians? I mean, this is why you have these religious groups splitting off, why you have Sunnis and Shiites, why you have Baptists and you have Protestants and Catholics, and even within the Baptist community they're splintered. There's Southern Baptists, there are I can think of all of Baptists, but anyways, you know what I mean. And
since there's no methodology where one can say, I have the correct answer, and this is why. Look at my experiments. Here's the hypothesis. Here I went out and proved it and gathered all this data. They don't have that. Anybody is just allowed to say, I'm right, and yell louder or shoot more, and whoever wins that battle for a while, they'll count as the truth until another sect splinters or gets more powerful.
And for an example, in the article, and I'll read it here, it says, take for example militants fondness for beheading their captives, right? We've seen that's been in the news. It's been a big thing about, ISIS cutting off the 2 journalists' heads off. Jihadists typically justify this practice through referencing a Quranic verse, 47:4, which says, when you meet those who disbelieve, strike at their necks. And of course, there's variants of this depending on the different translations, like everything else. This is often supported by the many centuries of warlike and literally medieval interpretations. And that's really the idea. You're undermining hundreds of years of how these people have interpreted these books. So you're not going to defang Muslims by telling them, or these extremists by telling them they're not Muslims. You're not going to defend it. You're not going to defang this. All you're doing is you are giving them more reason than to follow these interpretations. We need to look at this in an objective manner. And I think there's a lot of, and I've been criticized for using the term politically correct recently, because apparently that's a term used by the right-wing crowd, and what little people know is that actually politically correct came up in socialist versus the communist, But anyways, not to get into the etymology of that. But that's the thing. You need to, without fearing about being politically correct, you need to call a horse, a duck, a duck. It is what it is, whether you like it or not.
Right, and Sam Harris has a nice article in Sleepwalking Toward Armageddon, and he talks about this issue. And President Obama, Sam Harris, despite everybody trying to brand him a certain way, is really liberal in most aspects. And when President Obama, who all of us atheists and free thinkers, everybody had such high hopes, when he gets on and says ISIL speaks for no religion, no faith teaches people to massacre the innocents, no just God would stand for this. Look at the history of religion and all the massacres. You can always go back and say, oh well, even though they were the religious authority for those 500 years, now we know better, and that was inaccurate. The real God is a just and merciful one. And
that's the thing. I mean, and that's, at the end of the day, religions have perhaps some moderate and good components to them, but they also have some very horrible things. I mean, Christianity condones slavery. Do we see slavery today? Is slavery condoned by Christianity these days? No. But
human morality moved on, and then religion will grudgingly catch up.
It's following slowly. But in Islam, it's been much different, in a much slower process, I think. The moderate Muslims, and even a moderate Muslim, like, what is a moderate Muslim? What does that mean? Because every time, and this is taking it from Sam Harris, with Christians and Muslims alike, every time you say, I'm a moderate, okay, all you're doing, though, is making a conversation so that you can't criticize that religion, because not all Christians or Muslims are like this, therefore it's not fair for you to criticize it. And that neuters the whole idea of criticizing anything.
Right, you just need to separate out the Muslim individual from what Islam teaches, and those tenets are very harmful.
Right.
But let's move on to our second thing I want to talk about is young teenagers will do as young teenagers do. And so we actually have a picture on this one where there was a young boy who, a 14-year-old, and the statue of Jesus outside the city of brotherly love. So this was in Pennsylvania, I forgot the exact town. So he was getting funky with the statue of Jesus, and you can criticize it, or you could assign him some whatever if that, if he's out in public and doing something. But he's facing 2 years in jail because this was desecrating a venerated object. And what do we do with this? Do we really send a kid to jail because we do worship these?
About her, was she in jail?
No, she was fine because that was just Ronald McDonald, and that was.
That's okay,
she's
but
a
the
kid.
other one's not. I see.
Right. But,
so this idea that desecrating venerated objects all of a sudden is a law that puts people in jail very closely reminds me of Sharia in Islam. It very closely reminds me of heading towards that slippery slope of starting to put critics of religion in jail. And I think this is a very serious and very dangerous thing that they're doing in it was Philadelphia, right?
Well, it wasn't Philadelphia, I forgot it was ever, but it was in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it really is absurd that here in the 21st century, this is anything other than a joke that they're doing this. And you'll see the people, the Michelle Bachmans, worrying about Sharia law coming to America, yet they're the ones that really want to bring it here in its Christian form. And if we're not worshiping idols, what harm did that actually do with that?
It's blasphemy is a victimless crime. There's that's the thing. You're seeing a lot of this in the UN, for example. There's a lot of Islams and even Christians and Jews that are in the name of not being offensive or offended, they're passing these anti-blasphemy laws. And I think that's a stifling of free speech, first and foremost. It's a stifling of critical analysis of any idea. And it's a horrible thing for society to start doing this. I mean, this is starting to, and we're seeing it now in this country with a 14-year-old kid.
Where's his freedom from religion to make an expression that he thinks this is all bogus, or that he thinks it's too commercial, or whatever he wants to say? I mean, you can have everything else, but once you touch something religious, you're going to go to jail.
It becomes an issue. And this is kind of reminiscent of a couple of years ago when I lived in Loudoun County. We were battling the courthouse, or the Board of Supervisors of Loudoun County, for the courthouse lawns for Christmas displays. One year, somebody put on a skeleton Santa Claus on a cross, and that raised all holy hell. And literally, it felt like it. And this huge backlash by the community, and it was vandalized, and the Board of Supervisors everybody was against it, as if it was something bad. It's freedom of speech. It is a critical idea and a critical analysis of an idea, and you're expressing it through an art form. No, we can't have that because it might offend some Christians. No. It is a constitutional right in this country to offend people. Okay, so long as you're not doing it in a bigoted or derogatory way, it is a constitutional right for me to say I think religion is wrong. If you get offended by that, that's your right to be offended, but I should not be facing jail time.
Now let's move to the flip side, where if something is good for religion, it's good for Satanists as well. So what's going on in Florida?
Remember that Satanism is a religion. Of
course it is.
So in Florida, Orange County, a while back there were, I forget the name of the church, some church group that was passing out Bibles after school. Now, they weren't forcing them on students. They were just sitting there after school with a table with a bunch of Bibles, and if students wanted to, they could come up and grab a Bible. Now you ask, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, it seems innocuous enough. Well, the problem is it's proselytizing in a public, taxpayer subsidized place. So you have to either not allow it, which would be ideal, or you have to allow everybody to do it. These are, this idea of the public square. It's either all or nothing. And so FFRF sued and said no. Well, actually, FFRF said, well, if you're doing it for them, then we want to go ahead and pass out some of our books and pamphlets, whatever the case may be. And the school board vetted these books, and they prohibited some of these books from being passed out and not others. And so FFI was like, well, it's wrong, you can't do that. And the school, of course, had all kinds of justifications. Well, this is not for, it's not much, you know, these kids aren't mature enough for this, you know. But it was.
I'd love to see what kind of science stuff they somehow rule out.
It was a form of censorship because they didn't like it. So, anyways, there was a lawsuit. And it was dismissed, however, not on its merit, and the school board agreed to allow the students to read these books. Now, this, of course, opens up the floodgates of, you're going to let one group, you're going to let everybody in. So, the Satanic Temple has decided to throw their hat in the game, and they are now going to be setting up a table, passing out what's called the Satanic Children's Big Book of Activities. And there you go. There's a picture of the cover there, brought to you by the Satanic Temple and the website. And what's interesting about this book is that if you look at some of the exercises, I know we have some other images of some of the exercises, like a connect the dots. You know, like there you go, that's a connect the dots of the pentagram. And the kid's name who's portrayed there is Damien. Is showing a class the way to make an inverted pentagram, you know, connect the dots to make oneself, or make one yourself, which is interesting. The other picture, or another activity they have is word scrambles. And here's what the interesting thing is, you know, so we always like to align Satanism with this bad, bad, bad thing. But if you read on the bottom there, it says, these bullies are mad and afraid of things they don't understand. Help Damien use inclusive language to diffuse the situation. So you have things like their justice and, you know, these types of things. And it's funny to me that the Satanic Temple is being more inclusive and more humanistic than the Christian Bible. And here's the thing, though, about the Satanic Temple and their tenets. They're very humanist-based ideas about inclusion, about self-reliance, about being believing in yourself, which is, you know, interesting because most people don't think of Satanism in that way.
Well, you know, if you look at Satan as a trickster character from mythology, a lot of those tricksters are actually trying to help humanity, whether it's you know, Prometheus, or, you know, they created humanity, they were very moral, and yet they got put in chains. So you could look at maybe Satan is the good guy and God, and they are trying to bring humanism. And we're kind of running behind on time, so we want to move along. We're going to cut away for a little bit in just a minute here. Our next guest, Mark Reimers, is a humanist, and we're going to go through brain and evolution. We got a couple of announcements to make first. One is that Eric Herman has the Nondescript Atheist Show, and you can catch that from 6 to 7 on Thursday on radiofairfax.com. We'd also love to get, today we're not going to do call-ins just because there are some technical problems, but in general, we would love to start having more call-ins on the show. They'll put the numbers up during the show, so if you're an atheist that wants to speak about something, you'd like a little platform, we're happy to help. If you're somebody who's religious or not a skeptical thinker and you disagree with what we're saying, just call in, we're happy to talk to you. And that's it. If you find the show helpful, if you think skeptical thinking is important, they can put up a check where you guys are able to send donations that helps us go do interviews, get to events that you want covered, and you know, every little bit will help.
And don't forget to, you know, money obviously will help us out with things. There's a check right there. You can write it to Fairfax Public Access, and the attention to our producer, Paul Sheehan, who does a wonderful job, along with Kerry Rafter, who does another wonderful job at making things happen in the back. But we also need help in the back. If you want to learn about TV, you want to learn about how to make TV happen, or you want to be a host, or help us out. We need help. This is a wonderful facility, by the way. It's state of the art. I was surprised when I first started doing the show, the technical things back here. But anyways, we need help. We do have a team of people, and they're all wonderful people. Sorry if I didn't name everybody. I'm forgetting names. It's been about a few months since I've been on the show, so now I'm like trying to get back into the swing of things. But help us out.
Martin will have a word with you later.
Martin will have a word with me later. See, this is what happens when I try to thank everybody in the back. I put my foot in my mouth.
They look angry, so we better cut away. This clip from Atheism TV, and we'll be back with Mark Reimers in a few minutes.
From Catholic youth camps through the Reimers camps of conservative Judaism, there is a rich history of religious groups using summer camps to strengthen the denominational identity of young American people. And now, Hindus living in the United States use the same tactics of cultural reinforcement. Shana Sippy, a professor of religion at Carleton College in Minnesota, who has studied Hindu American educational organisations, estimates that 135 such camps now exist across the country. They aim to instill cultural knowledge and show children how to be confident in their background and Hindu faith. Mississippi said, "Time and time again, parents and community leaders have recounted to me how the American conception of camp offers an opportunity for a cultural, religious and linguistic immersion with other American Hindu children. That is understood to be even more important being within the dominant Christian culture." One such camp, Hindu Heritage Summer Camp's approach, is built around a set of rituals. Morning reveille is blown on a conch shell in homage to Vishnu. Between their wake-up call and the meal, the campers assemble in a parking lot that includes both a basketball court and a portrait of Lord Rama, a Hindu deity, made of coloured rice grains. They also sing Rise and Shine, an American Christian song about Noah's Ark, a story that also happens to have a Hindu parallel in the myth of Manu. The remainder of the camp day toggles between yoga, worship, drama, cricket, arts and crafts, and classes on Hindu philosophy. Such programming attracted campers to fill all 200 slots over two-week sessions last summer. Children came from across the United States and from Belgium. Several were offspring of intermarried interfaith families with African, Irish and Italian roots. Joseph Wesolowski, a highly respected ambassador of the Holy See, had been ordained both as a priest and a bishop by St. John Paul II in August 2013. He was recalled from Santo Domingo after rumours emerged in the Dominican Republic that he had sexually molested young boys. Wesolowski was defrocked after a Vatican tribunal found him guilty under canon law of abusing young boys in June this year. He recently appealed that sentence, and a final decision is expected in October. On 25th of August, the Vatican's chief spokesman, Reverend Federico Lombardi, said Wesolowski had lost his diplomatic immunity, adding that he may now be exposed to proceedings elsewhere.
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humour, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait, look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
All right, we're back with Mark Reimers now. Mark is a statistician, a neuroscientist, works in genomics. He's an international lecturer. He's been on the show once before, and today we're lucky to have him back. He's going to talk about the brain and morality with a little evolutionary slant. So Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rob. And Larry, can you hear me?
Yes, yep. Perfectly.
Great. So this topic is in some sense a follow-up to the topic we did a few months ago on the evolution of the human brain. And it's also a reply to those who say that really, that atheists can't have a morality. And what I'd like to emphasize is that many of the evolutionary developments that have brought about our species' separation from the apes, at least in terms of behavior, are developments that involve the social brain. And the aspect of the brain that is most involved in relationships with other people. And those areas have grown much bigger in human beings than in other apes. All of our brain has gotten somewhat bigger, but the areas that are concerned with the moral emotions seem to be even bigger. than a scaled-up brain would lead you to suspect. And I'd like to suggest then that feeling responsible for toward other people, feeling loyalty, feeling some obligations, these sort of social and moral emotions, have been crucial to what it means to become human. And I'd like to invite you just to imagine a primal campfire. A million years ago, if you were on the savannas of Africa and you could somehow fly over the area where our ancestors were living, and you could come to one of these campfires, what would you see? What strikes you about camping in the open in Africa?
Might need to be huddled together for protection.
Well, you're not going to get much sleep that way.
Well, I mean, it's...
You're all...
Go ahead.
Well, just think about it. I mean, most people have got to sleep, but somebody's got to stay awake.
Mm-hmm.
And be warning other people. There's an awful lot of dangerous animals,
sure,
both big and small. And so for our species just to have gotten through night after night, there must have been people who were taking turns on watch, fulfilling obligations to their group.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you don't ever see in other apes, for example. They don't, they all go to sleep together privately, but they don't take watch. And I think this is one of the things that one of the ways in which I think we can see that these sort of feelings of responsibility have been crucial in our evolution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd like to take this a bit further and talk a little bit about empathy, which is, can you show the first slide there? Empathy is a word that's become much more prominent in the last 20 or 30 years. It's actually an English literal translation of a German word, einfühling, which really means to feel into. And it was thought to be stronger than the word sympathy, but it really means that you're imagining their situation and feeling or imagining deeply what they're feeling until you feel the same kind of thing. And you can see on the pictures that I'm showing, the first picture,
yep,
that empathy activates some fairly discrete areas of the brain.
Yeah, could you go over each one of those real quick?
Sure. Sorry, could you repeat that?
Can you go over so we have those images at the bottom of the brain scans, and then the different areas highlighted, obviously highlighted, I'm assuming, where the empathy regions of the brains are. Is that correct?
Yes, so what we're looking at is a picture of a brain in cross-section,
mm-hmm,
sort of imagining that you could see, you could split a person's head in half,
mm-hmm,
along the midline, and we're looking at which areas of the brain are especially active in most people when they are feeling empathy. And we can see that in particular, I'd like to draw your attention particularly to the second image, in which you're looking at the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC,
mm-hmm,
in the jargon. And that's an area that is responsive when you yourself are feeling pain, and also when you are watching someone else in pain.
mm-hmm.
Do primates share those same areas just in lesser degrees?
Yeah, so it seems to activate many of the same areas, and I'm not sure that we would even say it's a lesser degree. It's highly variable between people, so
right,
not everybody feels empathy the same way.
Exactly, and that's why I think you have, and I think that maybe another topic we're going to talk to you a little bit about psychopathic behavior, and people that have a lack of empathy. They just cannot put themselves in other people's shoes, so to speak, because of this variability. I mean, I think there are, I've seen it, different people don't see suffering the way some people see it.
And I think you raised the idea of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And this has been a very active discussion in the neuroscience, social neuroscience community, because many of us know people who are really feelingful. They care about others, but they may not necessarily be very accurate in their interpretations. And we also, many of us know people who are very accurate at reading other people, but really don't give a damn. And they use that information to exploit others.
To exploit others, right.
And it's just been, I think, fairly recently come to prominence in social neuroscience that really these two capacities are quite distinct. And if you look at the two images on the bottom right of the picture, those are the areas of the brain that seem to be most commonly active in individuals who are figuring out others. They're not necessarily feeling for them or caring about them, but they are figuring out what's going on.
Does this relate to autism at all? Can you pinpoint where their problem is?
Yes, it does. It seems that, so many people think that autistic individuals have no empathy, but this is actually not strictly true. And it's still, it's not clear that autism is a single thing, that it's pretty clear that people who get the diagnosis of autism are often quite variable in their capacities. And some of them may have a strong capacity for empathy and others not, but they typically don't have both empathy and mentalizing ability.
And I know it was on the slide here before, but can you bring it back to common terms what the difference between empathy and mentalizing is?
So empathy is that you feel for and care for other people's suffering and even their joy. Whereas mentalizing means that you can figure out what's going on with other people. You can understand what their emotion, you can predict what they're likely to do and how they're likely to respond to situations.
And so that's sometimes when you were talking about people can use that, and if they can mentalize very well but lack empathy, they can figure you out and kind of exploit you. I guess that's where we're going with this, correct?
Yes.
Have you gotten any data on CEOs of major corporations where their brains fall?
It's funny you should say that.
Yeah. That's
certainly, the Robert Hare wrote a book recently, Snakes in Suits, arguing that many people who are quite successful in the highly political world of big corporations, and for that matter, any really highly hierarchical organization, that many of those people show characteristics that are commonly associated with psychopathy.
And that's very interesting, because we always talk about in the business world it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's a pretty rough place to be, and a lot of people can't handle it. And you got people that are very aggressive, that they become successful, they move ahead, and they don't care who they run over, who they throw under the bus. And that's interesting to study the psychology of those people, and then those who just can't. And I think what you're saying here, and there's clear brain areas that are directly responsible for this type of behavior. I think that's very interesting stuff. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, Mark, so I know that there are other animals that can feel empathy. Are there other animals, primates perhaps, or even other species that can mentalize, figure things out, exploit other animals?
So this is again a very active topic of research in primatology, and is I'd say somewhat controversial as to what extent apes can mentalize and figure out each other. They certainly can try to deceive each other. They may, after a fight, when there may be one of them's trying to make up, the other may sometimes let the one approach and pretend to be all willing to reconcile, and then when they get in range, grab them and beat the crap out of them. and there are a variety of other kinds of deceptions that are commonly practiced among apes. So they do have some ability to put themselves in each other's shoes. And it's been well documented that they are capable of empathy. There's many well-documented incidents and many experiments showing that apes can feel, and respond to and take account of the limitations of others, or try to soothe their distress. But they certainly don't seem to be nearly as good at mentalizing as people are.
Right.
And I would argue that that's one of the, if you look very closely at this picture, the third picture from the left on the bottom there, you can see, I don't know if you probably can't read the labels, but it's ventral, medial, prefrontal cortex at the sort of, if you look at that third picture, if you look at the bottom left area in yellow, that's the area that's just behind the eyes. And that's one of the areas that has expanded most dramatically compared to chimpanzees. And I think I actually have a story.
There's a slide on it. Yep.
If you looked at slide number 4.
Yeah, it's on now.
Slide number 4.
Yep.
You can see that direct comparison between a chimpanzee on the left and a human being on the right. And you can see that the human cortex is about 3 times as big as the chimp cortex.
Right.
And that's fine. But if you look at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex area, that seems to be more like 5 times or 6 times as big as the chimp area, corresponding chimp area. So there's much more going on there.
If you look at animals like dolphins, elephants, where do they fall into this kind of stuff?
So although the brains of dolphins and elephants are organized very similarly, all mammal brains have basically the same kind of basically the same kind of structure. They have emphasized very different parts of their brain. So we have generally expanded prefrontal cortices, and particularly this ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Elephants have very greatly expanded temporal lobes, but not necessarily greatly expanded prefrontal lobes. And dolphins have very greatly expanded parietal lobes, which are for us at the back, but not very much prefrontal cortex. So we have no way of imaging the brains of elephants or dolphins. You can't imagine putting them into a scanner. And so we don't really know what goes on and how they use their brains. It's clear that they have grown different areas, and presumably then they are using those areas preferentially. But how they're doing that and what the relationship to empathy is, we don't know. We do know that both dolphins and elephants are highly empathic creatures, and some people say they're more empathic than human beings are.
There is a great TED talk, if you guys are familiar with the different...
TED,
yeah, TED. And by a gentleman of the name Franz de Waal. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He's written a number of books.
He's a very famous primatologist.
Right. And he kind of talks about a lot of this and has videos that he shows during his talk about and he uses elephants and also primates, and it's a very interesting perspective when you look at these animals and how they're able to empathize. They have a sense of fairness. I think we'll talk a little bit about that. The pillars of morality are seen within the animal kingdom, and it's because of these exact evolutionary trajectory, where humans may have the most developed areas, but that is still remnant in some of these animals, or maybe not remnant, but evolved with them, maybe not to as large of an extent. It's a very interesting, I urge our audience to take a look at that. It's Franz,
Franz de Waal?
Yeah, F-R-A-N-S, and then it's D-E-W-A-A-L, I believe. So on TED Talks, I would look at that, and that just kind of mirrors what Mark here is saying. But that's interesting.
So Mark, I want to take you away from the science just for a second, and just, you're also the leader of Richmond Humanists. And as a humanist, we had an interesting experience. We had a squirrel in our house, caused lots of damage. The baby squirrels were in there. What kind of empathy do most humans feel toward a fellow primate or in themselves versus a squirrel versus a fruit fly? Do you think as a humanist this should tie into whether or not they have a theory of a mind and how cognitively developed they are? And do you have any sense for where most people fall and what they care about and what they don't?
Well, there's several questions in that, Rob. And as someone who has dealt with squirrels and baby squirrels and sometimes saved them and sometimes tried to get rid of them, I can sympathize with the moral conflict you feel. They are, like all baby mammals, baby squirrels are appealing to us, and they trigger some, deep instinctive caring response, without which our species wouldn't have survived. But I think you're right that we generally feel more of a feeling of identity with creatures who look or act like ourselves. And I'm not sure that whether this is something that's, quote, innate or this is something that's learned, or to what extent. I believe that younger children seem to be, in many cases, kind of widely empathic about different kinds of animals, whereas adults seem to be very focused. They'll be empathic about their family, other human beings, maybe their dogs, but not necessarily about any other creatures, and sometimes not even about other people of different skin colors.
It's funny that you mentioned with the kids, because our youngest was certainly, oh my goodness, how sweet, we've got to save them, as opposed to like, we just had all this work done, they're destroying the house. When we went upstairs and found them and the little babies were squeaking for their mother, though I had a very visceral reaction where it really changed things, and you suddenly had this wash of empathy that really wasn't there before. And what happens in your brain or with chemicals that are released, is there something triggered there that would give me that response?
That's a good question. I read some research on it, but it's still being explored. You can't. There's definitely some specific kind of brain activity in response to babies, to human babies. I don't know if anyone's done the same study responding to animal babies, but there's a kind of stereotypical response. Certain brain regions become very active when you're looking at babies, if you feel an interest in babies. Not everyone does. That seems to be somewhat variable.
Sure. It's interesting you mentioned that. I have the same kind of issue sometimes. I own a lot of snakes, and sometimes I have to feed these snakes. And unfortunately, snakes are not vegetarians, and they do eat meat. And so oftentimes I buy pre-killed, frozen mice, but sometimes a snake won't take that. So I have to go and find live mice, and oftentimes the snakes are too small to eat a full-grown mouse, so they have to eat little baby mice, And my stepdaughter, she came to the store with me one time to pick up these baby mice. She goes, "Oh, they're so cute," and I said, "Well, you understand these are for feeding. This is food." But the minute she heard these little guys squeak and getting ready to go into the mouth of a snake, she just freaked out. She was like, "Oh," and she took one, tried to hide it to save it, but she didn't have that response until, she conceptually understood that this is food for the snakes and not a pet. But the minute she saw them and heard them squeaking and actually saw what was about to happen, then all of a sudden she went into this, I gotta save the baby mice, from the evil snakes kind of thing. It was kind of interesting to see that. So I said, okay, no more feeding live snakes in front of my stepdaughter. And so
I think that's often the case, that we, when we hear the sounds of a young animal in distress, that we are very highly motivated to act.
Right.
And I don't know how much of that's general empathy and how much of that's specific to the human. You may know that the sign of a baby crying is one of the most irritating sounds that any adult can bear to hear. And it's like we have to act. We feel compelled to act, and I think that's partly why the species has survived.
Yeah.
Because babies are so irritating in many other ways.
Anyways, so speaking of empathy, how So we're talking about this being an evolutionary trait, right? It's an evolution, mentalizing, empathy, all these things are evolutionary. Do you think that religious people have more empathy, or is there any science or any evidence to show that these brain regions are bigger in religious people than, say, atheists?
That's a good question. I can give you a very indirect answer to that, but let me first close off the window where the crows are. Can you hear
I
the
am
crows?
hearing squeaks, and I thought that was being done on purpose to elicit some kind of response. So, Mark will be right back. He went to...
And when you get back, you can also tell us about, with guilt and shame, should we feel guilty about doing bad stuff to squirrels, or are you going to shame us into it? But we'll get to that when we get to that.
So first of all, I think you are probably aware that a number of studies have been done comparing sort of the morality of religious people to the morality of atheists in practical situations. Again, people who volunteer for these experiments, and you're looking at their self-report of how religious they are. And that generally speaking, the results are a wash, that religious people are no more, in experimental situations, they don't cheat less, they don't help other people anymore. There's a wide range of variation between individuals, and there seems to be as much of that variation among religious people who claim to be religious as people who deny being religious.
Because I really do think, first of all, without being too guiltful, can you kill the crows right now? Because all joking aside, but what's interesting about religious people is mentalizing, right? I think they're very good at doing that and exploiting people for money. I mean, I think they can do that very well. I've seen that happen.
Well, yeah, the people that run, not the regular religious.
Faith healers and televangelists do that. Yes, they are the kind of psychopath who rises to the top of a hierarchical organization.
Exactly. So
yeah, I want to hear more about the guilt and the shame, because also either whether it's economics or religious leaders that are manipulating people. Are some people just, you can't possibly shame them and they'll never feel guilt? Are the two related? Do they happen in similar brain areas, or is there a series where you have to feel guilt before you can feel shame?
Okay, well, let's take a look at the next slide, slide 5, guilt and shame in the brain.
Yeah, we'll try to pull up the slides, and but go ahead and what is it? Okay, so, guilt and shame. Okay.
These are, we're still working out what the relationship is between guilt, shame, and embarrassment. It's clear that these are essential social emotions for human society. It's not clear entirely how they evolved, because they're emotions that seem to work against the immediate desires of an individual, but they seem to have been important. They're vital for group life, and therefore they have been important in the early hominid evolution. They seem to activate different areas of the brain, and they also seem to have different mental health consequences. However, what I'm telling you right here about the specifics is not universally agreed on. So people don't, the areas that, I'm picking, from one study that finds that, again, for guilt seems to activate the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, especially the bottom part, and the anterior cingulate cortex, whereas shame seems to activate what we call the temporoparietal junction, and also some other areas depending on which study you read. The temporoparietal junction is a pretty robust finding across many studies for shame, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex across many studies for guilt. And it seems that these are activating different kinds of brain regions, so they're probably fairly distinct emotions. I think many of the time, in real life, we often experience a blend of both of them. So they may not be clearly distinguished in our lives. I think there are people who seem to feel very little guilt, and that's one of the characteristics of psychopaths. Now, just in terms of the mental health consequences, there have been a number of studies. Again, the consensus is not reached yet. I happen to like the work of Judith Tangney, and whose work's not too far from where you're interviewing me right now. And she's done a number of studies looking at what, proneness to guilt and proneness to shame. And, again, a simple-minded reading of pop psychology would suggest that if you're prone to guilt, you're likely to have mental illness. And she suggests that, in fact, the opposite is true. In her studies, it seems that people who readily feel guilty and try to repair a relationship. So she defines guilt more specifically in terms of how motivated you are to repair a relationship, whereas shame seems to motivate people to withdraw, to hide themselves, to cover themselves.
Is there a difference between men and women for the amount of shame versus guilt that you're aware of?
There probably is, but I don't know it.
Okay.
That wouldn't surprise me. One of the German study suggests that some of the areas that men are activated in men for both guilt and shame are activated only in women for shame. So it's really hard to. There's probably real gender differences, but we're not. We haven't really reached a consensus on those.
Right.
Can you say there's another related subject of empathy and sympathy? Can you sort of define those two, and then are there any correlates in the brain where those light anything up?
I can't find any clear definition that corresponds to neurobiology that distinguishes sympathy from empathy. There's various popular definitions that make empathy somehow stronger. I think really, if you look at the literature of the early 20th century, people were using sympathy in virtually the same way we use empathy now. And it somehow got to be trivialized, and people wanted a stronger word. Sympathy came to seem too trite. So I don't think there's any real deep neurobiological difference between the two. Sympathy is now thought to be, very, a non-committal kind of feeling, whereas empathy seems to motivate you. But I think, if you read even Adam Smith up until, William James, sympathy is a very strongly motivating emotion. But it's really only, I think, in the latter half of the 20th century that people use sympathy so glibly that it was thought to be devalued as a word.
Oh, it's interesting. I didn't know that. I always thought there was an actual distinction between the two, but that's an interesting perspective on that.
So we got about 5 minutes left. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the chemicals, what goes on in the brain at the chemical level that makes people feel warm towards something or rage towards something? How much is known about those? And does it have any medical implications for medicines that you could treat with?
Well, certainly, the chemical that's in the news these days is oxytocin. And it's certainly involved in sort of strengthening bonds between, parent and child, and between lovers. It's not entirely clear that it's a universal empathy chemical, and the results of trying to treat autistic kids with oxytocin have been somewhat mixed.
Okay.
So it's not clear that it's a universal solvent for human relationships.
Right. From an evolutionary perspective, what does oxytocin really, why do you think it evolved in our brain?
Well, it's pretty clear that it's evolved to assist reproduction.
Reproduction, okay.
So it's reproductive behaviors is what it's, history in all mammals, and even going back into egg-laying reptiles. That oxytocin's the, helps release milk. It helps, and also nurturing behaviors. So, but it also in human beings seems to have acquired, and in several other mammals, seems to have acquired other functions. Such as motivating pair bonding in certain animals, and in strengthening relationships between people.
So is it correlated with monogamy?
That's a good question. So certainly in animals, in certain animals it is.
Okay.
So if animals that have certain kind of small forest mice that have more oxytocin receptors are more monogamous.
Right. I've heard about those studies.
There are polymorphisms. There's genetic differences in the oxytocin receptor in human beings. There was a recent study from Sweden that showed that there was a very slight 4 or 5% increase in marital problems among people who had one version of this compared to others.
Regardless of religion, I would assume.
I'm not sure about that, but in Sweden, there's not much religion.
Not much religion anyway, right?
Just to come back to a question that you asked earlier, I think Rob asked earlier about differences in brain between people. And I think it might be a good way to end looking at slide 6. There are, Rob, you asked about a difference in brain regions or brain size of brain regions between people who felt empathy and people who didn't. And that study has been done and nothing was found. We cannot find, or at least these people, the people who did the study, could not find any substantive or consistent differences in brains related to empathy. But they did find some consistent differences in brains related to what you might call very broadly sort of conservative, moral, foundational values. I'm using Jonathan Haidt's terminology. So particularly values like loyalty and obedience to authority seem to be pretty highly correlated. Also values like emphasis on holiness or on purity. All of these seem to be correlated with the size of two regions in the brain. One is, again, our favorite ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and another is this area called the insula. But the big one is ventromedial prefrontal cortex seems to be...
Mark, we have about 30 seconds left.
Okay, anyway, so there are brain differences, and they seem to be correlated. Nobody knows whether these are born or whether they're acquired.
Right. Interesting. And that's, I guess we'll have to continue this discussion because we're just about out of time.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Thank you, Rob.
Right. Yes. But I do want to thank you for being on. And just so everybody knows, I've met Mark about 7 years ago. He's a great guy, professor at VCU, getting ready to move on to bigger and better pastures. He's going to leave us all behind here.
Yes, Richmond is very sad to see you leaving. Yeah, Mark, I think, may join us in the future, talk about evolution of religion. We'd love to hear more about that and how that ties in with the brain.
And we'll definitely
happy to do so.
Get back. So I want to thank our audience. Thanks for being here and viewing. Check us out on Facebook and YouTube. And I guess we're going to have to catch you guys next time. Remember to come and join us if you have some time. We really need the help and we really appreciate it. So.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.